So this is a healing about a woman in her 50s who came to me with severe cramping in the intestines. And I've done a number of healings with this woman, and she always complains about a bulge in her belly, saying, "Oh, it looks like I'm pregnant." And there's already, been tests. She gets all worked up. She goes, gets a colonoscopy and ultrasound, and the doctors have never, they've never found anything. And a few doctors have even really made her really mad by saying, this is all your imagination. It's all in your mind. And that makes her really, really angry. So it's one of the reasons that she and other people who know they're experiencing something, but the doctors, the equipment, the scans, the tests, the blood tests, etc., can't find anything physical. So it's one of the reasons she and millions of others seek out people like me, where we work at an energy level. So basically, when I went in this time, I haven't seen what I saw today before, because sometimes you got to work with somebody for a while before you get peeling off the layers. Usually it's the more recent layers first. This woman's in her 50s. So what I saw today occurred when she was in her 20s. And so it takes a while to peel away the layers of trauma. Life, things happen. Life, it can be very, very traumatic, and it gets layered in the aura. So when I'm doing the healing work, not all the time, but usually it's going back in chronological order in terms of the more recent traumas. I'm erasing and pulling out first, and then we're going to deeper and deeper traumas. Sometimes we go way back. The person had some kind of horrific trauma in 4 lifetimes ago, and it's been sitting there all that time, and the universe, God, and the body intelligence says, I got to get this poison out from 4 lifetimes ago. So sometimes there's like a divine intervention, a real intervention, like a surgical right inside, and pulling out that one crazy trauma from 4 lifetimes ago. But usually, for the most part, it's more or less chronological. So what I saw this time with this client was when I tuned into the cramping, the intense cramping, and then all of a sudden I saw a whole baby in there, a full baby, and it looked very much alive. And I saw my client in a reclining position, not quite in giving birth yet, but it seemed to be in a hospital bed. And there was nobody else around. It was just her. And I was looking at the baby, and then there was this intense cramping. And I also saw all these fluids, and I'm assuming was all these hormones flooding like a pretty intensely moving river, flooding down to the baby. Now, in this particular healing, I wasn't picking up all the full body convulsions that a woman would go through in labor. So sometimes these healings, they're peeling off. If a trauma is so big, it takes a few healings. The body's, giving you the echoes sometimes, in this case, it was giving me the cramp, the intense cramping, and also the flood of the hormones, and the discomfort. I definitely got tremendous amount of discomfort. But then all of a sudden, what I saw next was what felt like the water breaking. And then the next thing I saw was a nurse, basically holding a lifeless baby. And at that point, I was like, this is a stillborn. And then when I looked back at the, my client, the mother, 30 years ago, she was kind of out of it. Really didn't know what, was maybe they gave her some drugs or, epidural. I'm not sure. And she wasn't sure either. It was all really, really cloudy when I asked her later about it. In fact, she said, yes, I had a stillborn, and went on recounting once I explained to her what I saw. Basically what I saw was, again, her being out of it. And it really felt very emotionally empty, like there wasn't that much support for her. So what I know about this woman's life currently and also back then is she's married to a corporate executive, somebody high up in some kind of big corporation. And, he was kind of detached emotionally. The way she described it to me, she was like, I was a sex slave, also is cook and cleaner in one. That's how she described it. My feeling about it was he wasn't a horrible guy, but he was detached and very busy, and wanted to grow a family, but really, didn't have that real magical sense of, a life. Just, for him, this is what we do. We got money, he'll have a good life, he'll go to a good school. But the mother, of course, in her 20s, she really didn't have a very high self-esteem. She married this guy, maybe for the money, I don't know, or the lifestyle, or maybe he was, very good looking back then, and et cetera, et cetera. But she found out pretty quickly, how he valued who she was. Again, sex slave, cook and cleaner in one, and baby maker. So, when she had the stillborn, basically she was all alone. I saw that. I saw basically she felt, guilty. She felt shame. She felt very, very, very lonely. This was like, because, and, she didn't have a great big, loving family on both sides, that really, really were with her. And they had, everybody knew she was going to give birth, and there was definitely some sense of, gatherings and, cooking and inviting all the people. But a lot of it was his corporate world and their wives. So there wasn't a lot of real support. If she had the baby, they'd give presents and there'd be a big celebration, and then everybody would go back to their corporate lives. But for this woman in this life, having a stillborn, I basically saw she was completely lonely. She felt, like she had failed, that she wasn't, a successful woman. She didn't do her job, and basically it put her in she was in a total cloud, goodness knows, probably for months. Not only that, but her body's trying to recuperate, God, 9 months, and that was a healthy, looked like a relatively healthy baby, but something happened. These are total mysteries. Something happened. And so the woman, of course, has to regroup and replenish her red blood cells and all of her all the exaggerated bloating and everything that happened physiologically during those 9 months. So this is not only emotional, but this is just a trek up the Himalayas to come back, to be ready. She's in her 20s. She's like, well, The doctor says I'm still okay. I can have more babies. So this is a climb, a trek up the Himalayas to even conceive of getting back on the boat, getting back on the treadmill, getting back, her consciousness, the heart, the anticipation, the baby room they made, all the little baby clothes they either bought or got donated, everything. Now I didn't see the spirit of the baby on the spirit plane. I've done quite a few healings with women who are pregnant. I've done some healings with women who've had abortions, healing them from that. And I've seen the spirits of the babies. One recently, I remember I saw the spirit of the baby, and the mother was having a really, really long labor. She missed her due date. And so I went in and I had to talk to the baby spirit. There was some complications in the family, then the baby sitting there, on the spirit plane looking down from what when I saw, and seeing these, arguments and, people who are sort of distracted, the grandparents, and, and life is going on there. And the baby's looking down going, I'm not ready. I'm just not ready to come in yet. So, so I came in and I talked to the baby and, filled the baby's imagination with what's exciting. Because I knew there was a lot of really exciting stuff, in the mother's life in that particular case. And so I talked to the baby and got the baby all excited to come in, and all the sports he's going to play, and everything that's waiting for him. And then a couple of days later, finally, she gave birth, like I think it was a week after her due date. So but this whole thing about a stillborn or even abortions, and in the healing of abortions, I've sometimes seen the baby hovering. And a number of my clients have said to me that they still communicate, or they have some kind of psychic communication with the baby that was aborted, or miscarriage. So trying to open their angelic consciousness, their connection to what I call the high astral, the seventh layer. In my terminology, the seventh layer of the aura is where the angel energies come in, and then you have the sixth layer, which I call it the lower astral, but there's like a lower astral, and then there's a higher lower astral before we get to, the more heavenly realms. So the kind of soul that could come down, a lot of times depends on the consciousness of the parents, and whether or not they treat themselves and their bodies and their lives and their consciousness like a temple. So there's so many dimensions to this conversation, but I should say that at the end of this healing, my client said she didn't feel any of that intestinal cramping anymore. So, when you do these kind of healings and you see these kind of visions, obviously, there's no way to prove it. No way to prove that I took out the auric remainder of her baby that ended up being a stillborn. There's no real way to prove it, but she had intestinal cramping, very intense. The doctors couldn't find anything physical. I went in, saw the baby, saw the water break, saw the stillborn afterwards, saw her, the whole emotional tragedy that followed her for months and months after that. And then I asked her how she was doing at the end of the healing. She says, well, the cramping is much, much better. So who knows, right? So, but this is the mystery of the energy realm and energy healing. In my case, the aura healing. So, all right.